Good morning, Malacañang Press Corps. At sa ating mga bisita, nandito tayo sa Weekly Economic Forum. Today we have Assistant Secretary Tony Lambino of Department of Finance to introduce our guest.
Salamat, Rocky. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Thank you for being here. This is actually the third weekly economic briefing of the Duterte administration's Economic Development Cluster hosted by the PCOO. And it is the third because we took a break during the pre-SONA weeks, and that was a series of 3 pre-SONA events. So we are now back for our weekly briefings. In his 2018 State of the Nation address, President Duterte applauded Congress for the timely passage of the train law, for making funds available for building better roads and bridges, improving health and education, and strengthening our safety and security. He thanked Congressmen Kua, Gonzales, Abu, Garin, and Batucabe, and the Swansing couple for filing Train Package 2, a measure that will lower the corporate income tax rate, the highest in ASEAN at 30%, for all businesses, especially small and medium enterprises that comprise a large majority of businesses in the Philippines and employ around 65% of Filipino workers. The President urged Congress to pass all packages of the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program and rice tarification as a SEP for, and I quote, "There is no chance that we can deliver our promises without an equitable tax system," close quote. One of the most important responsibilities and duties of the government is to make accessible and high-quality education available to the Filipino public. And this is reflected very clearly in the 2019 National Expenditure Program. And to speak on the topic of education and affirming the importance of the train law, I would like to introduce a stalwart of service in the Philippines, which is evident in her public commitments as well as personal convictions. Please welcome Education Secretary Leonor M. Briones.
Good morning, fellow Filipinos, fellow citizens, and fellow taxpayers. I have been introduced as the Secretary of Education, but this time I will be speaking not only as the Secretary of Education, which is a major beneficiary of the tax efforts of the government, but primarily as a student of public finance, and discuss with you briefly the importance of the tax system of the Philippines. Now, very briefly, I will go through 4 small topics, hopefully, quickly, hopefully. Pero I cannot promise that since I'm used to lecturing to my family, especially my husband. First, I will quickly review the key components of train because you had a break, so perhaps it would be good to look back at the key components of train. The main policy objectives, again, very, very quickly. Third is the assessment of inflation in relation to train, because the impression is very strong and powerful that train has contributed or is the major contributory factor to inflation. And finally, what I feel very strongly about is the need for the public to change, to shift its present mindset and attitudes towards the payments of taxes. Now, the major components of train you are already familiar with, and you have covered them already. First, and this is the good news, the provision of significant tax relief to individual income members. You were informed that those Filipinos, taxpayers with incomes of 250,000 and below will not be paying taxes at all, income taxes, zero taxes yun. Or 20,000 a month, that is in train. kung 250,000. And as Secretary of Education, I'm very happy about this because many of our staff, including teachers, would fall along this salary scale. The second is the imposition or increase in the excise taxes of the number of goods. And there's a good reason for this. For example, on manufactured oils and fuels, on sweetened beverages. I rather like this because last year I issued a circular discouraging, not only discouraging, but forbidding the sale of sweetened beverages in school canteens. Mainly just sugar and water and coloring, pretending to be juice. And then also automobiles. In many countries, these vehicles are taxed very, very highly, as we can see in the case of Singapore. Tobacco, I fully support it because Social Watch Philippines, of which I used to be the convener, supported the idea of increasing taxes on tobacco, not only for tax reasons or for revenue reasons, but for health reasons as well. And this was a very long effort and battle. And then also on mineral products. And the third, which is also good news, is the limiting of VAT exemptions. We know value-added tax. And the effectiveness of a tax can only be as powerful as the less exemptions there are. If you pass a law and you put in a lot of exemptions, then it does not have any push at all. It loses its power. And you are favoring particular sectors. No. And then improved tax administration, as can be seen in the many decisions of the President with regards to the revenue aspects, which is largely tax collection for local taxes, Department of Finance, and of course, the Bureau of Customs, Bureau of Internal Revenue. And then another development, which is also a good thing, is that the early yearly incremental revenue, because train is going to result in additional revenue, this has been clearly earmarked. So, hindi mo magalaw for other purposes. And this would be the Build program, sugar industry development, and then very, very important, the mitigating measures for those who are suffering, for example, from the impact of inflation and the increase in prices. And this has already been described to you by the SWD Secretary. And then social welfare and benefits already reported to you. Now, very quickly, the policy objectives of TRAIN is acceleration and inclusion. Inclusion not only spreading the tax net, but also inclusion in the sense of making available government services to more and more Filipinos. And this is very clearly seen in our experience in education. So tax relief, social mitigation, infrastructure, growth, and social investments. And then very quickly also, the table is quite extensive. Here you have for 2018, for example, total increase in tax revenue is calculated at 89.9 billion pesos. But there will be a loss of 146 billion because of the exemptions in personal income tax, which we are granting to those with lower income, but increases in other direct taxes. Okay. Now, on the issue of train and inflation, this has already been explained by NEDA and by the economists. And the impression is that train is largely responsible for inflation. While it is correct to say that inflation has been rising, and the numbers show that the latest inflation number for June is 5.2%, but perhaps it is not correct to blame train for inflation, because now it is recognized not only in our country, but in many other countries as well, that external factors played a major role. And this is when the world price of crude oil increased, and also when there were movements in the exchange rates. kasi we are very dependent on oil. When the exchange rate moves even by a peso or two, then the impact, as I said, on the economy is very powerful. So there were also delays in rice importation, and this affected the prices of volatile food items. This was also explained to you by the Department of Trade. So again, you have a chart which shows the rise in the price of crude oil to $73 per barrel. And then also another chart which shows the movement of inflation factors. Now, again, it is generally accepted that inflation becomes worrisome. You worry about inflation when an economy is spiraling into crisis. And this has happened earlier in earlier administrations. Inflation goes up, economy is in crisis. That really worsens the sufferings of the Filipinos. But right now, the economy is not spiraling into crisis. This is recognized both by critics as well as defenders of the present administration. We are not spiraling into crisis in terms of the economy, and that is also recognized not only by here in the Philippines, but also internationally. In spite of everything, you know that we have strong GDP growth, and this was affirmed by stable ratings from three major rating agencies recently, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P. And trade, in fact, is a major in the strong economic performance of the economy. Now, again, my perspective is that both as a citizen, as a professor of public finance, and as secretary of the Department of Education, I believe that suspending a revenue generator like train will do more harm than good. During our last cabinet meeting, I explained that when there is a huge demand for resources from government, more and more services are expected of government. We have more than 1 million kids entering kindergarten. We want more roads. We want more school buildings. We want higher salaries. And this is already scheduled for 2019. SSL, the increase in the salaries of government officials and employees, scheduled already for this, for 2019. And all the increasing, accelerating demands amidst an increasing population. There are only three ways of solving a fiscal demand. One, either you cut down on expenditures because you don't have money. Usually you do that at the level of personal finance. You make a list of what you want for a particular period, match it with your income, and decide what you will give up. You cannot do that in government because what we are now experiencing is rising expectations from our people who are also increasing in number. More education, free college tuition, more infrastructure, more jobs, more assistance to the very poor who are suffering as we admit from inflation. So reducing expenditures as far as any sensible person will think is out of the question. You can do it with your personal budget, but not necessarily with the budget of the government, because you cannot help but have increasing expenditures. The second alternative, of course, is to raise your income, is to raise your revenue, to raise your taxes. And this is usually the preferred mode. Raising taxes because we want development, we want more schools, we want more roads, we want higher salaries, we want more clothes, we want more allowances for the poor. We pay for it also. We divide the burden with those who are getting more, contributing more, and those who are getting less, benefiting from such increases in expenditures. The third alternative is to borrow. Those of you who were already born at the time of the at the height of the debt crisis of the Philippines are aware of my record as president of Freedom from Debt Coalition. We don't want to go through that horrible experience again during the 80s when we were drawn into the global debt crisis, not only of the Philippines, but of Latin America. And it took us how many years to finally recover. It's a terrible experience. I'm very glad, I'm very happy that you, at your age, looking at the state of your complexions and the state of your clothes, did not have to go through that debt crisis at that time. So debt is also out of the question because there is a limit to borrowing. So where does that leave us? No to decreases in expenditure, no to borrowing. That leaves us with raising ourselves, growing by our own bootstraps. So as I said, we will do more harm than good. We will have to suspend our 3.5 trillion budget, which is already being prepared and which will be presented to Congress. However, as I mentioned earlier, and as reported to you by DSWD, the painful impact of inflation is real. I suffer as the poorest member of the cabinet handling the biggest budget in the entire cabinet system. I know how it is to suffer from inflation. My husband is complaining about the price of NFA rice because we eat NFA rice. And he longs for the days when NFA rice was affordable. And it's not easy to deal with it. And the emotional response always is to blame taxes. But government is taking this very, very seriously. So it is implementing social mitigation measures. This has been reported to you. The Bangko Sentral has been using its policy instruments to control inflation through monetary policy. And there is close monitoring of prices also as reported to you earlier. Finally, what I would like to share with you, I look at each and every one of you, and perhaps those in the audience, as fellow students in public finance. Historically, no human likes the idea of paying taxes, whether you're a Filipino, a European, or an American, or an African, or a Filipino. We associate taxes with oppression because historically, taxes were imposed on oppressed people. Look at the Roman history from where we learned our tax laws. Read the Bible. The Bible, you know, the Israeli people, they were split into two after the reign of Solomon over the issue of taxes. Look at the United States, the Boston Tea Party. And you don't even have to leave the Philippines, the Basi Rebellion, the onset of the revolution when people started tearing up their cedulas. And those of you who still have time to read Noli Me Tangere, how taxes drove Sisa mad because her children were taken away because they could not pay their cedulas. And so this is a very strong resistance to taxes because it is an imposition. No human likes imposition. No human likes to be forced to pay something on pain of penalty. But this kind of attitude has to change because taxes now will pay for the education of our children. Taxes will pay for the bridges that will allow the children to cross rivers without swimming across them to go to school. Taxes will build hospitals. Taxes will perhaps help create jobs, as in the case of the graduates of our technical vocational program, who, even before they graduated, because they were already trained to work, already had jobs. So, still, the resistance to tax is there. We cannot relate taxes with nationalism. All of us love our country, but we will do everything to avoid taxes, of course, to avoid and evade. I tell my students, I would faint from surprise if on March 15 or April 15 every morning, I tell my students every day, on this day, you wake up singing at the top of your voice because you're going to BIR and to pay your taxes and to contribute to the country's development. No. You are in a bad mood, you quarrel with the BIR, you think of ways of avoiding it, or even perhaps not paying taxes at all. And this is where media can be very useful. We have no choice. Taxes, it's either taxes or borrowing. It's either taxes or no schools, or no hospitals, or no bridges, or no offices, or no relief for our poor. So the choice is ours. It's very difficult to erase, not just in the case of the Philippines, maybe 400 years of resistance and anger at taxes. You go back to thousands of years to the Romans, to the biblical times, when taxes were triggered revolutions. They triggered revolutions, they triggered wars and murders, and when taxes were used to finance battles, conquests, and also lifestyles of whoever is the ruling person. The challenge for us is not only to shift, to help the public shift from their mindset about taxes, but also to watch where the taxes go. And this is where our motto in Social Watch is, pera ng bayan para sa bayan. Even as we pay taxes, we have to watch where the taxes go. And this government, this Department of Finance, is committed to that, to make sure that the taxes that you pay for train, for whatever additional impositions there are, will go to where they should go. And if that happens, then perhaps we will be smiling when we file our income tax returns. Thank you.
MPC, do you have a question? RJ, you have a question? Microphone, please. Secretary Briones.
Ma'am, DepEd matters po, okay lang? Ma'am, DepEd matters po, okay lang po. Ma'am, how serious is the issue on scarcity of teachers in the country today? Qualified teachers, licensed.
It's not so much scarcity. One reason is we are reducing the sizes of classes. You used to report in your childhood and in your youth about classrooms with 60, 70, 80 pupils. We are reducing it to a minimum of 45. To be able to do that, we need more teachers. We introduced also the senior high school program. In the senior high school program, there are 4 strands. You have the academic strand, then you have the technical vocational, then you have sports, where you really need special teachers, and then you have arts and design. So we need different kinds of teachers these days. Before, we relied on academically trained teachers. This time, we need teachers with different skills. And we also have a lot of catching up to do. So I would not describe it fully as a shortage, but as a reordering, as reforms in the content of education which we are introducing. And therefore, DBM has allowed us a maximum, and this is why they have to work very, very hard, because we are going to get, and will be allowed to employ 75,000 more teachers. And many of these teachers whom we need should be proficient in English, math, and the sciences. Yes.
Ma'am, in your accomplishment report for 2017, the ratio for high school is 1 is to 25. One teacher teaching 25 students. Is it right?
No. One teacher for 25 students at the elementary level. Yes, kinder level.
What about high school?
High school is 1:40.
So if we go around the Philippines right now, wala na tayong makikitang 60 students sa isang teacher.
Not necessarily. And we are trying to reduce that if we get all the teachers that we want. And this is why we need additional teachers.
We have reports that a lot of private schools, small and medium private schools, are closing down. Bakit daw po?
The because. You're asking me, what is the because? The Secretary of Education was the first one to call attention to this phenomenon. The because is teacher salaries from the private schools are not competitive anymore with the salaries of public school teachers. This is something the public is not totally aware of. You remove the 5 leading private schools who can happily survive with or without government assistance. Think of the private school in your home province, in your municipality. Think of the church school, Protestant or Catholic or Muslim, and they cannot compete with the salaries of our teachers. The average salary for grade 1 for the public school would be 21,000 plus 2 months vacation leave, 2 months Christmas, 2 weeks Christmas vacation, and all other benefits. And the private sector cannot catch up with that. So usually after young graduates pass the examinations, the board examinations for teachers, they move on and apply to the private sector. And this is what I call a migration. And this is a serious policy concern.
So what can be done, ma'am?
What can be done is what is being done now. There are schools, if they make a presentation, and it's a reasonable presentation, they're allowed to raise their tuition fees. CHED does that also. But the law says, this is an old law, any increase in tuition, 70% has to go to the increase in the salary of the teachers. But there have to be other ways by which private school teachers can be persuaded to stay in the small private schools. Small private schools, I have gone to private schools, 6,000 ang starting, 8,000, 9,000, vis-a-vis 21,000 starting for grade level 1. And this is something we have been entrapped by the romantic notion that public school teachers have very, very low salary. But that has already changed.
For 2018, ma'am, how many of these private schools applied for tuition fee increase?
I think there are several hundred of them, about 500.
I will check that.
Yeah, we are checking the numbers. And their application has to be reviewed very, very carefully. And as I was saying, you have to make sure that if they're allowed to increase their tuition fee, 70% of that has to go to increase in the salaries of their teachers so that their teachers will stay. But of course, there are private school teachers who are faithful to the private school systems, whatever the rates of the salaries are. As there are public school teachers who are faithful to the public school systems, whatever level of suffering they claim to be subjected to.
Out of 100% who are applying for tuition fee increase, what percent do
I
we
would not know.
do we approve?
I think if I recall correctly, it's just about 947 private schools
Applied.
who have been granted tuition fee increase. The grant of tuition fee increase, they would be required to submit all their documentation because it requires them to establish that there's a certain percentage that has to go to teacher salaries. I think as much as 70%.
And
There's-
that's out of how many applicants, sir?
We do not have the record of how many applied for the increase. What we have is the record of the number of schools, 947, which comprises 7% of the total number of schools in the private sector.
Ma'am, the closing down.
But at the end of the day, it's really the choice of the pupils and their parents. A school which raises its tuition fees, and for whatever reason the parents still decide to send their children to that private school, that is their choice. What we are giving them is a range of choices. Public school, which is free, college, which is free, and private school, which has tuition and which offers also particular services parents are interested in. At the end of the day, it is their choice. If they choose to go to a particular private school or a particular public school, that is their choice, and we give that to them.
Ma'am, private schools closing down, this is alarming, right? There's a proposal to create a special department, a bureau of private schools. Isn't it? Do we recommend that? Do we support that?
We used to have a bureau for private schools. But right now, we have to study that very, very carefully because we will have to be asking for more taxes from you to create the additional bureau.
So it's
For
not
the
yet possible
position
this
of the
time.
director and everybody else to create when a law is passed, you can be sure there's always a financial implication. When a policy maker opens his or her mouth and says we are giving this to the public, praise the Lord, hallelujah, there is a financial implication. And at the end of the day, it goes back to us, to our taxes.
What's the possibility of this, ma'am? Creating.
I cannot say that at present, but this is being proposed because we used to have a bureau of private schools before.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you very
RJ. Tuesday New with Secretary Briones is Yusek Malaluan of Department of Education.
Thank you po. Ma'am, there is this suggestion from some local government units that the suspension of classes during typhoons be tasked back to the Department of Education. What can you say to this, ma'am?
It used to be the task of the Department of Education, but the public was complaining. We are 7,000 islands with very different weather conditions. I am from the south, for example. When I'm in Negros, and it's the hottest day ever, there can be a flood right here in Manila. And usually what we want to do, what the lawmakers wanted to do was to save time. And it is usually the local officials who love their people, who immediately go out when there is a storm or a disaster to find out what is happening. They go there very much faster and earlier than we could ever do so. And we'll have to collate the data. And this is the reason why it was given. So you have decisions. If you will notice, one city says we don't have classes because there is a flood. But another city says we have classes because there is no flood. The sun is shining wherever it is. Even in Luzon, you have varying weather conditions, and this is where local government units are so much more on the ground, and they know what is really happening. I think the issue here is who gets the blame. Who gets the blame? Some local government units are not happy about being blamed as to the timeliness of the decision. And the reason behind the policy of asking local governments is, in terms of timeliness, they would be much faster. Because they're right there where the storm is, where the flood is, where the earthquake is, before a DepEd officials will ever have an opportunity to go. Kasi what will happen is the supervisor, the principal will have to text, and all that, inform everybody, and make the announcement by the time the rain has already stopped, or by the time the earthquake has already cracked open an entire municipality. So that is the reason.
So you prefer, ma'am, na it would be with them na lang yung responsibility?
Yeah, in terms of speed, because, as I said, local officials, especially at this time, I'm very sure they're very concerned and they love their constituents, especially the children and the parents of the children.
Thank you, ma'am.
Tina Mendez.
Ma'am, in relation to, during the President's SONA, he mentioned about the need to approve the remaining train packages to etc. Sir, ma'am, there is just like barely half a year to approve these laws. And considering it's an election year next year, there are lawmakers who are hesitant to push for this. If not passed, how will this adversely affect the education budget and the continuation of the government's program for the Free College Education Act?
The adverse effect is obvious. Government will have to borrow, and rates will be higher.
Nonetheless, ma'am, with the President's...
Because if Congress will approve, and normally it will approve, the proposed budget of the President, and the funding, the source of the funding will not be made available, then the recourse is to borrow. Unless also Congress will cut the expenditures, which it will not also do at this time.
I think the Budget Secretary Jokno earlier said that all the cash-based appropriations are already incorporated, including yung mga kita sa first train package.
That's true.
What I'm asking is, if the remaining train packages are not approved, how else will the government be able to continue its plans after 2019?
That's what I'm saying. Because the plan is already laid out. That is the last recourse, of course, is to borrow.
So,
And that is not the most pleasant experience that one can undergo. When a finance minister goes off to Washington for the World Bank IMF meeting, and then goes to Paris for the Paris Club meeting for the private bank, it's not the happiest and most inspiring of experiences that a country can go through, especially with a country like the Philippines, which had a very unhappy experience during the global debt crisis.
thank you.
And of course, the impact is, of course, the law of supply and demand. Interest rates will be higher. They probably will lend, but it will be at higher rates of interest. This is why I believe that taxes is the better option. But we have to watch where the taxes go. And we have to watch who are going to pay those taxes. And this first part of the train, make sure that those in the lower income groups at 250,000 and below will be spared that kind of burden.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Malacañang, press corps, questions? Last question na tayo, Joseph Morong.
So, ma'am, just to highlight, no, you said that the education sector is one of the beneficiaries of the train law. So, in terms of figure, how much are you receiving from the first package?
Our total budget is 570 billion for 2019.
So if you suspend the implementation of the law, medyo tatagilid to, no? And in
Yeah.
terms of breakdown,
No. If Congress passes the budget
okay.
but does not pass the train law, then government will have a problem because it will have to borrow. Because once the budget is passed into law,
Yeah.
then you have to implement it, like it or not.
In terms of breakdown, the 570 bulk goes where?
Largely to the salaries of nearly 800,000 teachers.
How many again? Sorry.
Nearly 800,000 teachers. And then we have the school buildings, which we have to build. Yes. Computer laboratories. Learning materials. By the way, Joseph, we are going to have a thorough review of the curriculum of the Department of Education. After all, we have been there for 2 years already, so we have made enough experience. We'll review the curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12 because we have been getting feedback as well, and we are welcoming feedback from the public about curriculum content, so we're reviewing. And secondly, since we have the largest budget, this is what I feel very strongly about. As part of the rationalization program, it's not that government is just increasing the budget, but what are they getting in return? They want us to rationalize our program, our organizations. My priority is our financial management system. We have to review and we have to reformulate our accounting, our disbursement, our accountability systems because of the hugeness of the department itself. And then curriculum, we are going to review it as well.
Because again, ma'am, ano yung mga complaints?
We have had a lot of feedback about the curriculum.
Not being competitive and all?
The curriculum was started when we came in.
Yeah.
Kasi we brought in high school, senior high school. So entire curriculum from kinder up to grade 12 was changed when we introduced senior high school. But 2 years na ngayon, kailangan i-review uli. Because right now, Joseph, as we are sitting, changes are occurring. Our dearly beloved principles of science are now being questioned. Many things are happening in this world which our children have to catch up with. For example, there was a demand before that we should teach our children more English so that they can compete in the BPO, the call center, because supposedly these are good jobs. But call centers, Joseph, are now replaced by robots in other countries. So if you are preparing our children to speak beautiful English for call centers, then perhaps we will truly be left behind. We have to teach our children to be the ones to make the robots. And this is why we are teaching robotics in the high schools. This is why we are sending teams of public school, high school kids to other countries, and they are winning in robotics contests.
So you mean to say, ma'am, that 2 years ng SHS na curriculum, that's already out of step with the times?
Because the times is always changing. Times
And very fast.
does not wait for anyone. Tempus fugit.
So they are outdated.
Yes.
Outdated, ma'am, we can call
Yes,
it.
so what we want, Joseph, our children to learn, which probably my generation did not learn, was not memory work. We don't teach them multiplication tables because they have their cell phones. We teach them how to analyze, how to solve problems, how to respond to change, and to accept change. Because by the time they graduate, whatever we have taught them, not all of them will be applicable. They will not be able to recognize the world that they're going to enter because change is happening so fast. But it is in dealing with the change that we want our children to gain more, yung tawag natin life skills. Oo. Kasi ako siguro, I will not pass high school anymore. If I were to take an exam in high school. Oo, kasi multiplication table lang alam ko eh.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you.
Joseph. Last question, Tuesday New.
Yes, ma'am. I understand, ma'am, that recently PIDEA had a meeting with DepEd on their proposal that grade for your pupils be subject to drug test. What happened to this meeting, ma'am, and what have you agreed upon?
We did not only have a meeting with PIDEA. We had a meeting with PIDEA, with PNP, and with Dangerous Drugs Board. All three of our leading agencies which are in drug enforcement law. And we presented our sides. We compared our numbers and so on. And they requested us to support, as you were saying, their proposal to subject 10-year-olds to drug testing. We said we cannot do that because the law is very clear. The law says that any drug testing, random drug testing, will have to be at high school level. And secondly, you have to consider also the provisions of the Privacy Act, because you're talking here about kung 10-year-olds, maybe 8 to 10 million children whom you will subject to the test. And so there are many requirements. It's not a simple thing like asking the children, tomorrow you put your urine in a bottle and submit. It's not like that. So we said that we cannot do that in consideration of these two laws. And also, of course, the administrative aspects will have to be considered. But what we are doing in our drug testing, I'd like to repeat it again. For our main office, central office, 100%, all of us adults, including myself, all of us, 100% drug testing. For regional offices, 100%. For children, for high school, 20,000. Now you have a survey, for example, political survey, you talk to 1,200 people, and the findings, you take it very, very, very seriously. You make or unmake a politician's career out of an interview of 1,200 people. We are testing 20,000 children. For the teachers, 24,000 teachers sample. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the press, because you knew all the time we announced last year that we are going into drug testing. And thank you for not asking for results, where, how many, who, and so on, because that is something which we consider very confidential, because the child's name will never be revealed. The teacher's name will never be revealed. The purpose here is prevention. It's not for sanction or punishment. It will not be a basis for expulsion. It will not be a basis for disciplinary action. The purpose is health. It is a health policy. And it has been approved by the President himself and the Cabinet. President only asked one question: why are you doing this? What is it for? And I said, and he asked, is it preventive? And I said, yes. Then he approved it, and the entire Cabinet approved it. So PIDEA and PNP and Dangerous Drugs Board have to be patient. They're going to sponsor a bill for this Congress to make it mandatory. But of course, we have to see what will be happening, because society, of course, will participate in the debate for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joseph, last question, Joseph. Microphone, please. Briefly, Joseph.
Sir, sa finance po. ASEC. So reaction lang, can you go to the podium, please? Reaction to the Senate, Senator Soto said that they're very lukewarm about passing the package 2 because medyo napaso na yata sila sa train 1 because of the inflation. Your reaction, please.
We need to keep reminding everybody of the benefits that we are receiving from train. As Secretary Briones has said, no, we need the taxes to fund vital services, our infrastructure build-up, education, healthcare. 99% of our income taxpayers now have more money in the pocket. Their take-home has gone up by what is equivalent to a 14th month pay. We are also supporting health agenda of the government by we have raised the excise tax on tobacco. We have also introduced an excise tax on sugary beverages, including artificially sweetened beverages. Again, unhealthy products that hopefully over time we change our consumption habits around. But for now, we can collect the revenues and make sure that they are invested in very worthy initiatives such as public education. So of the 90 billion incremental revenues from train in 2018, 30% is earmarked for social services. That's around 27 billion for education and healthcare, and 70%, around 63 billion for infrastructure. And in the infrastructure space, we are spending more than 50 billion a month, and 30% of that is wages, new wages in the construction sector. So for 2018, that's more than 93,000 jobs in construction from train. So we have to keep reminding everybody of the benefits that we are already receiving from train and the support it is providing to the most important investments in human capital and hard infrastructure. At the same time, for train 2, we also need to convince the legislature that it is worth the time and effort. It is a measure that will reduce the corporate income tax for a vast majority of businesses in the Philippines, mostly small and medium enterprises. We have the highest tax rate in the ASEAN region at 30%. We would like to bring it down to 25, possibly 20, if we can even push it down that far. At the same time, we want to reorient our incentives program so that we are oriented toward the industries of the future, such as what Secretary Briones talked about earlier, in robotics, in aerospace, and in other areas that the Bureau of the Board of Investments will identify as strategic investment areas for the country. So we really need to convince those who have doubts that this is worth doing and that it can be done within the time frame
So
that
yung
we have.
package 2 ba, meron pa siyang contributions sa inflation?
Ang package 2 ay revenue neutral. So it's designed that way. So as we reduce our corporate income tax, we are also recovering incentives, and we are reorienting incentives toward performance targets, such as the creation of jobs, the investment in the countryside, in areas that are less developed, and for bringing research and technology to the country.
Sir, paulit-ulit na kayo dito, no? Yung sinasabi niyo lagi, pakiulit na lang ulit, na yung train law is really not the sole factor for inflation because it increases in prices in fish, whatever. Can you repeat that explanation to assure lang the Senate, maybe to convince them?
Sure. Train does make a contribution to inflation. It is a limited contribution. It's been estimated at 0.4 percentage points out of the 5.2% inflation rate that we experienced in June 2018. Again, inflation is a year-on-year comparison. It's actually a rather abstract concept. Hindi yan yung talagang nararamdaman ng tao kasi what you're doing is you're comparing prices in June 2018 to prices in June, which is what I paid for something a year ago. That's not how people experience prices. So while we know that the main drivers of inflation are the international imports of oil that went up 50 to more than 50%, from $50 a barrel to more than $75 a barrel between May 2017 and June 2018. The exchange rate, nabanggit po ni Secretary Briones kanina, mas nagmamahal po yung imports natin pag yung exchange rate, kung ang piso po ay nagde-depreciate laban sa dolyar. At the same time, we had supply issues in agriculture, fisheries, and other areas. Those were the main drivers. But again, year-on-year comparisons are artificial. Ang talagang mas maganda tingnan in terms of what people experience is the month-on-month inflation rate. From May to June, it was close to zero. Yes, and from April to May, it was close to zero. And from June to July, it was actually just 0.6%. And the two main drivers of the 0.6% month-on-month inflation are, of course, education expenses kasi nagbukas po ang klase. So tuition goes up every year for private schools, as we know, and malaki po ang demand for school supplies. Pangalawa po, nagkaroon po tayo ng problema sa supply sa vegetables dahil po talagang naanod yung maraming vegetable crops, kaya po nagtaasan yung presyo. So those are the two main drivers of the month-on-month inflation of June 2018.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Assistant Secretary Tony Lambino. Thank you kay DepEd Secretary Leonor Briones and Yusek Malaluan. Thank you Malacañang Press Corps sa ating mga bisita, Yusek Badoy. Back to our main studio sa Radyo Pilipinas and People's Television Network.
Thank you, Rocky.
Thank you.